Thanks, Dan, and thanks all of you all for coming in. For those of you who are in my class, it's a boy now. So I might just stumble a bit because I spent the whole 24 hours there and I'm a little bit sleep deprived but very happy. So that would be the reason I'm giving for you, right? So let's start out. I want to start with a map because we always hear about Cuba, but maybe we don't realize exactly how close we are. So this is the island of Cuba. 90 miles away is Miami. So you see, we really are very close. We've also got Mexico, Central America, and the Bahamas. So and then here's Puerto Rico, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. So we really are all together in this geospatial network. And yet, sometimes the way we talk about Cuba and think about Cuba, it might lead us to think that it's this foreign country way on the other side of the globe. And so also because we hear Cuba, oftentimes we might have a connotation associated with it without really having much understanding of the history. And especially for those of you that might be contemplating taking the study abroad, but I would say that most people generally don't know much about the history. And the history of this country and also its history of its interactions with other countries is really pertinent to what I'm going to be talking about, which is state repression in a particular social movement. So we're going to take a dip into Cuban history. Don't get freaked out. I'm going to go very quickly, and it's just a light brushing of it. So again, this will be very familiar to you. In 1492, Columbus also discovered Cuba and claimed it for Spain. However, and then the British took control of it briefly between 1762, but they gave it back in 1763. And then Cuba had been fighting against Spain for the War of Independence for 10 years, from 1868 to 78. After those 10 years, it ended in a truce, which is another word for tie. And state promised reforms and greater autonomy for Cuba, but did not deliver on that. Then José Martí led a second war of independence from Spain during this period of 1895 to 98. And the U.S. got involved in 1898. They declared war on Spain, and then U.S. and Cuban forces together defeated Spain. Spain gave up all claims to Cuba and ceded it to the U.S. And then from 1898 to 1902, Cuba was occupied by the U.S. military. And in 1902, Cuba became independent. However, we have a Platt Amendment that has given the U.S. the right to intervene in all Cuban affairs. So in 1909, Jose Gomez became president, and this was following elections that were supervised by the U.S., a familiar scene. But he became, soon after the election, mired in corruption. And in 1912, the Independent Party of Color, this was a political party that was representing black Cubans. They were being discriminated against severely. So this political party was protesting against their discrimination, but they experienced a severe backlash by members of the community, but the government as well. And there were thousands of black Cubans killed during this what was actually a massacre. In 1924, Gerardo Machado was, sorry, I should have moved forward so that you get a better understanding of where I am. Gerardo Machado was elected president, but he instead established a brutal dictatorship. And we had a period of university student movement protesting the government in the 1930s, but later during that year, Machado was overthrown by a coup by a military leader, Batista. There were three other presidents that served during the period 1933 to 1940, but in 1940, Batista retired. So Batista was elected president in 1940, and then he retired in 1944. So then Cuba had a series of two other men that were presidents during that period, 1944 to 1952. So Batista had been in military power since as early as the 30s, but in 1952, Batista then stages a military coup and appoints himself president. And we had some, Cubans were hoping for democracy during that time, but Batista established another dictatorship, and he ruled over Cuba in an oppressive and corrupt regime. So we see these periods of, attempts at democracy, but then becoming more of a dictatorship. So just to give you some perspective of how the U.S. experienced Cuba during the 50s, Havana, which is the capital city, evolved into a playground for American movie stars, their celebrities, and their wealthy jet set. So they had these big-name musical acts, fancy restaurants and bars, resorts and bordellos. And so you would have Americans just flitting over there. It's very quickly a short plane ride, and to use that basically as their playground. A Cuban historian named Luis Perez, he wrote that Havana during this time period was what we might equate with Las Vegas, and not the nice part of Las Vegas with the fancy Bellagio, but maybe the Las Vegas on the fringes. And there was also a large mafia presence there, running gambling, drugs, and prostitution operations, as well as paying off government officials. But if we're talking about outside of Havana, poverty was increasing during this time. And also a little bit differently compared to other Caribbean islands, Cuba did have an upper middle class. It was a large upper middle class. Although Cubans had fought vehemently for independence from Spain beginning from the 1860s, really all the way through the 1890s, by the 20th century, Cuba had become economically dependent on the U.S. And this slide should just give you an example of the amount of economic ownership that that America had over Cuban properties. So American firms, American corporations owned 90% of Cubans' mines. So they were extracting all the natural resources from Cuba for their use. American firms also owned 80% of its public utilities, 50% of its railroads, 40% of its sugar production, and 25% of its bank deposits. So the U.S. really had quite an investment in Cuba. And not only was it just the economics, but also American influence extended into the cultural realm. So you had wealthy Cubans that were driving American cars, some of which are still on the road in Cuba today. But the wealthy Cubans owned American-made TVs. They watched Hollywood movies. Young people listened to American rock and roll. They played American baseball, they learned English in school, and they wore American fashions, the latest trends from the U.S. So not only was the economy weakening as a result of U.S. influence, many Cubans were becoming increasingly offended by what they thought their country was turning into, a haven for prostitution and gambling. And this is one of the reasons that in 1953, the Cuban Revolution began as Fidel Castro led an unsuccessful revolt against the Batista regime. But that was unsuccessful. And then in 1956, Castro and Che Guevara began a guerrilla war from the Maestra Mountains, Sierra Maestra Mountains. And in 1957, again, we see these students, a group of students that were also fed up with the corruption in the government. They stormed the National Palace, which is the site of the government. And then on January 1st, 1959, this is when Castro led a 9,000-member guerrilla army into Havana, and Batista flees. He left the country. Castro became prime minister, and then his brother Raul became deputy prime minister, and Che Guevara then became their third in command. So you see the history of what Cuba had experienced before their revolution. And as a consequence, or soon after the revolution, there were several reforms passed. So this one is 1959, soon after the revolution. The Agrarian Reform Law is passed. And this is when we're talking about reform, but really, truly, this was the expropriation process. This is where Cuba was taking over American-owned businesses. So some corporations, such as the United Fruit Company, refused the compensation that Cuba was offering them. And you may not know the United Fruit Company by their old name, but you probably know their more recent name, which is the Chiquita Banana Company, and their little iconic image, their brand, right? So in 1960, because Chiquita, or the United Fruit Company, decides we're not going to accept your lowball offer for our giant corporation, then the government expropriated their firm. They took over their farms and their everything associated with their business in Cuba. And that was a really big deal. And so in response, the U.S. then threatened to cut its sugar imports. So the U.S. was, at that point in time, importing sugar from Cuba. Cuba was the main source of their sugar. And so for the United States to then say, okay, we're going to cut your sugar imports. And so in response to that, then Cuba cut a deal with the Soviet Union to sell the Soviet Union sugar, because that's one of their main crops. They need somebody to buy their sugar. But as part of their payment for the sugar, the Soviet Union then shipped oil to Cuba. And by now, 2 of the 3 oil refineries in Cuba were owned by, they were U.S. owned, but they refused to refine the Russian oil. And so Cuba said, okay, fine, we'll take over your refinery. So they were forced to then refine the oil that came from the Soviet Union. And so then in retaliation, the U.S. cut all of its sugar imports that it was getting from Cuba by 95%. So you can imagine that this then put Cuba in a pretty grim spot economically. And so Cuba retaliated again by nationalizing, which also means expropriating or taking over all of the U.S. properties in really important sectors like the telephone, electricity, utilities like that, and then oil again. So most of the Cuban business owners then at this point in time that saw what was happening, and if they had ties to the U.S., they left. They fled to the U.S. Many of them settled in Miami, and then Cuba nationalized the banks. So we see that a lot of American interests had been taken over by Cuba in a series of sort of tit-for-tat conflicts. Some researchers, some historians say at this point that there were really 2 Cubans, and they were drifting apart further and further. So most of the upper class and ethnically white Cubans who had ties to the U.S., they fled. They went and settled largely in Miami, and this group of people is referred to as the exile community. And then the middle and lower classes, who were more ethnically black and less socioeconomically advantaged, they remained in Cuba. And soon after that, then we had another law for urban reform. These names are so incredible, right, with the word reform in them. But what this means is that the homes and the assets of those who left the country were confiscated. And so poor Cubans then moved into the homes of these wealthy landowners. And so you've got several families, poor Cubans, that have now taken over these wealthy mansions that were occupied by those who left Cuba for mostly Miami. So this property issue, this is at the center of any discussion about reconciliation between the Cuban exiles that are living in Miami and throughout other places in the United States and the Cubans in Cuba. So the exiles are demanding compensation for their business and their property losses. This is what especially is one of the main sticking points if you look at support in the U.S. for U.S. involvement or U.S. policies toward Cuba. A lot of support and a lot of influence comes from the Cuban exiles that are living in Florida. So again, and then in 1960, I'm sure you've heard of the economic embargo. This is when the U.S. placed the economic embargo on Cuba, even though Cubans sort of call it more of a blockade, but really it restricts anybody from doing business, any American from doing business in Cuba in 1960, especially trade and things like that. And then shortly thereafter, in January, Washington breaks off all diplomatic relations with Havana. Then in April 1961, there was a CIA-sponsored invasion force of 1,200 Cuban exiles who had been living in Miami, and so together they land at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, and they are soundly defeated within 72 hours by Cubans. And so Castro proclaims then that Cuba is a communist state, and he begins to develop an alliance with the Soviet Union. And then later, in February '62, the U.S. imposed a total embargo on Cuban trade and travel. And this embargo has been tinkered with a little bit, actually made more and more intense, but this is still in effect to this day. And later in 1962, Castro agrees to allow the Soviet Union, because they're allies now, he agrees to allow the Soviet Union to install nuclear missiles on its island. So here we've got these proposed nuclear missile sites, and here's the U.S. 90 miles away, and these are Soviet missiles. So you can understand the U.S. was pretty upset about that, and it became, Kennedy was involved in that, it became quite a nightmare and quite a crisis. And finally, this crisis was resolved when the Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles in return for the U.S. removing its missiles that we had in Turkey. So Turkey is pretty close to the Soviet Union. So again, it was a diplomatic resolution to this situation that was part of the nuclear arms war. Where people were trying to, attain more and more nuclear power in terms of this prospective war that we might eventually end up in. And in 1965, then the name of Cuba's single political party was changed. It used to be the Cuban Socialist Party, and it was changed to the Cuban Communist Party. And in 1976, then Fidel Castro was elected president. This is when they had reformulated their constitution. It was a socialist constitution and set up the terms of this socialist state. In 1991, if you recall what was going on in the Soviet Union collapsed. Its economic subsidies to Cuba ends. No more sugar crop that's being paid for by Cuba. And it also plunged Cuba into a major economic crisis because Cuba was dependent upon the Soviet Union for their revenue. That's the main buyer of any of their manufactured items and as well as their sugar production. And Castro called this the special period in peacetime because there were no assets, there were very few supplies for people to have any access to making a living. There were very few food sources. One of the articles that I read was quoting somebody who said, all of a sudden, all the cats and dogs on the island disappeared. And there were also, people were developing all these nutrition related illnesses. So it was a very significant time, but it became sort of a rallying cry for Cuban citizens to band together and suffer together during this special period. And, but really, Cubans were literally starving. It was a really bad time for the Cuban people. 1993, I'm not ready for that yet. 1993, then the U.S. tightens its embargo on Cuba. So we already had a pretty tight embargo, but we were giving them, or we were trading some medical supplies and medicines and things like that. So we cut some of those off in 1993. And at the same time, Cuba then introduced some market reforms, things that they had never allowed to happen under this socialist economy. But because their economy was just falling flat, they instituted some reforms such as all the farms at that time were state farms. So the government owned the farms, and so they allowed then some semi-autonomous cooperatives to farm some of the land. And then they also started legalizing a very limited number of individual private enterprises. So people were allowed to have perhaps a small restaurant in their home, but they couldn't employ people. It could only be a few people, maybe perhaps their family members. And there was no wholesale market. So there wasn't where you could purchase things for sale or purchase supplies for your restaurant. They still had to run this restaurant or run this small business, purchasing whatever was available on the regular market, which also led to the development of a black market as well, which was one of the consequences of this type of economy. And then in 1996, the U.S. made their trade embargo permanent because there was a shooting. Cuba shot down 2 small American planes. They were piloted by Cuban exiles who had been for a very long time flying over the island and dropping these anti-Castro leaflets over Cuba. So again, they were in international airspace, but right off the coast, and they were shot down by Cuba planes. And so in response, 1996 made the U.S. embargo permanent. In 2008, Castro retires, and his brother Raul then takes over as president. In 2011, we saw Cuba pass some more economic reforms because prior to this, people couldn't own property, they couldn't own cars because owning private property was against the socialist ideology, but they eased that a little bit up, and Cubans could own private property at this time. Fidel died in November of 2016. He was 90 years old. So you see a lot of, if you look at articles over the last maybe 20 years, they keep saying, okay, when Castro passes, things will be different, But he really held on for a very long time. And even though he was no longer president, he was very influential in what was going on in Cuba. And in April of 2018, Cuba elects a new president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, but Raul Castro is still very much involved. However, he's not president, but he is heading the armed forces, and he's head of the Communist Party. So Raul still has a significant amount of power in Cuba. And then as we were hearing, if you came to the discussion on the independent journalist, Cuba has passed a new constitution in February of 2019. It has some reforms. I think they were talking about that it mostly is word changes with not very much of substance, maybe a little bit, but it did permanently and forever make the nation a socialist country. So now what we're talking about is important to my section, but I think that you needed to see this history of what was going on in Cuba historically in terms of its context of the state repression and human rights violations. So in Cuba, levels of government repression wax and wane, or they're cyclical. You've got some periods of calm, and then you've got some periods of harsh crackdowns on political dissent. So prior to the 1959 revolution, human rights violations were widespread. As I mentioned before, Batista was brutal and cruel. The regime was corrupt. State authorities were responsible for killing, imprisoning, and torturing many of the government's political critics. So if you criticized the government during Batista's regime, you were locked up, tortured, probably never seen again. But then after the revolution, so if we're skipping from the period to 1975 to relatively currently, we can see that there is some fluctuation. So like in 1975, when this chart begins, we see that there were about 4,500 political prisoners that were in Cuban prisons. It dropped to about 2,577, 79, flipped back up to 4,300, and then it plummeted during the 80s to as low as 200. And then from this period on, we see some fluctuation between maybe 400 and 600 until around 1970, and we see this continuous decline from 300 to 246. And estimates are currently that there are about 120 people currently held as political prisoners in Cuba. All I can say is that data comes from Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch report that are very involved in gathering this data all over the world. So we haven't got this number from Cuba, so let me just say that. So if we're looking again a little bit historically, we'll see that the first few years following the revolution were characterized by a massive restructuring of the political political and economic system of Cuba. They're moving from this massive corruption from the Batista regime to how they are going to structure the government, the economy, and social life for their citizens. So this is a period of intense internal instability. So there was severe and widespread violence during this time, political violence. Various sources report that during the period right after the revolution in 1959 up through 1965, between 20,000 and 25,000 individuals were held as political prisoners. So this is where we get this idea of, or maybe in our minds, that Cuba is so associated with human rights violations and political prisoners. Because immediately after the revolution, then, Cuba took extreme measures to eliminate any internal threats, or what the government called counter-revolutionary activity. But really, what is counter-revolutionary activity? Well, at this point, in the early 1960s, many of those people that were characterized as counter-revolutionaries were basically people that had been members in Batista's state security forces. But then others were people who just basically criticized the new government. If you were complaining about the new regime or complaining about reforms or complaining about what was happening in the government, you were labeled an anti-revolution, a counter-revolutionary, which is a really bad thing to have been labeled at this point in time, and then you would suffer crackdown on dissent. And so that's the internal type of dissent, but also we had external threats that are also associated with more crackdowns on dissent. So for example, I mentioned the Bay of Pigs invasion. This was in 1961, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis, that was in 1962. At that point in time, security forces arrested individuals that might have been suspected of counter-revolutionary activities, and they were charged with political crimes. So the internal threats is dissent from within, people that are unhappy with the government, and the external threats happened outside of Cuba, but they wanted to make sure there was no link from the external threats to citizens. So making sure there was no internal threats associated with that. So these crises were met with internal repression. So the government was trying to neutralize destabilization of itself based on external threats, and also to not allow any destabilization to arise from within. So if we move past the 60s and we get into the early 70s, this was characterized by lower rates of repression and imprisonment. But even though the U.S. embargo was in effect, the Cuban state was less vulnerable to its economic impact because they had developed an economic relationship with the Soviet Union. And they also had some other trade partners across the world. So the 1970s were a time of decreased threat and increased stability. So we'll see how these go together. That graph that I showed you does really correlate to particular times of what was going on. So perhaps you've heard of this. In April 1980, several Cubans drove a bus through the gates of the Peruvian embassy in an attempt to obtain political asylum so that they could then go to Peru, go to some other country. So within a few days of the bus crashing through the gates, over 10,000 Cubans had gathered there seeking asylum. So you can just imagine, they were hanging from the fences, they were situated in trees, they were on the roof. 10,000 people in this small area with the hope of being allowed to leave Cuba. So they were seeking political asylum. So Castro temporarily suspended the illegal exit law, because there's a law that says that Cuban citizens cannot leave Cuba. But he had 10,000 people that were demonstrating so sincerely that they wanted to leave the country that he said, I'm going to suspend the illegal exit law. And he announced that anyone who wanted to leave the island could do so. So you can imagine the boats that were coming from all over Florida, from anybody that could have access to a boat. They drove their boat, they sailed their boat to the port of Mariel, where Cubans could jump on their boats and leave the country. So it's estimated that about 125,000 Cubans left this country through the port of Mariel. That's why we call it the Mario Boatlift, because think in your mind, all these boats are coming to rescue Cubans. And people were just jumping on the boats, and if they had anybody that they knew, if they had ties to people in the U.S. And so After this then, if we're looking at what happened prior to it, prior to this Castro's allowing all these people to leave, there was a period of intense internal unrest and increasing conflict. This is what drove the people to drive the bus into the Peruvian embassy. Sorry. And so because there was so much internal unrest, there was also harassment and intimidation of dissidents intensified during this period. So this is also the first time in history that Castro had allowed people to leave the island if they were dissatisfied. So by allowing Cubans that were dissatisfied and unhappy and were threats to countering the results of the revolution, Cuba then really effectively diffused much of the country's unrest. So instead of having to deal with the groups that were protesting against the government just said, okay, all you can just leave. Right? But only for this particular brief point in time. So this is what's called the Mario Boatlift. And then later, during the 1980s, after this period, Cuba maintained a fairly or relatively positive human rights record. So again, this period of waxing and waning. And now in response to the economic crisis that the Cubans suffered during 1991 because of the collapse of its economic sponsor, the Soviet Union, they suffered an incredible unrest. As I mentioned, people were starving. There were not resources for the Cuban people. There were, of course, no jobs. So Amnesty International notes that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba experienced a significant increase in state repression. Right? Because people are angry, they're frustrated, they're starving, their children are not being fed. And so there was a significant increase in state repression to deal with the increasing unrest of their people. So this was met with violent responses by the state security forces. And a number of illegal and therefore, or a number of independent and therefore illegal pro-democracy groups arose. And anything, against the revolution is illegal. So all these small little pro-democracy groups then that were arising were illegal, and so they had to be very careful about their actions. And but the people that were starting these groups were very frustrated with the government and and this concern about their severe economic crisis and the fact that they couldn't see that the government was doing anything to help. So in 1994, there was a series of prolonged blackouts. So the state couldn't even provide electricity for its citizens. So they didn't have electricity. Of course, they didn't have air conditioning as well. Blackouts meaning that there was no electricity. So anti-government rioting was taking place in the streets. So the Malecon is the seawall that goes along the ocean there right outside of Havana. And so this was what was called the Maleconazo, right? This is when people were protesting in the streets against their government because they had no food and they were desperately calling out for help. And so they were met, of course, with Fidel's Castro's army, but also Fidel himself appeared in the back of a truck with the flags and everything, and that was enough with, of course, the backing of his army, but also Castro himself, who settled everything down a little bit for the time period. And again, the second time that he lifted this illegal exit law, and he announced that, okay, whoever wants to leave the country can go. And you only had like 2 days during these periods of lifting the illegal exit act. But at this time, more than 35,000 Cubans took the opportunity to leave, but it was through making their own boats. So they were making rafts. This is a giant raft that they made with these big tires, and most of the rafts that people tried to leave on were small, homemade affairs. But more than 35,000 Cubans took the opportunity to leave, took their lives basically into their own hands, and most, of course, headed to the United States. It's 90 miles away, just across from Havana. And so this was the highest number of people that attempted to leave Cuba since the Mario Boatlift in 1980. However, the U.S. Coast Guard brought about 32,000 Cubans back to Cuba. So all the people that worked so hard to leave country ended up coming right back as well. And so another strategy that the Castro regime began during this time was the deployment of what they call rapid response brigades. It sounds so important, like a rapid response to an emergency or something like that, but really these were state-sponsored mobs that were used to intimidate and harass dissidents. And I'll talk more about those later. And in 1996, Cuba changed its strategies of repression from this political imprisonment to exiling people or detaining them for shorter periods and this type of intimidation and harassment. And this could be possibly because the international position of Cuba and its association with human rights violations, it doesn't present a very good image. And even though the tactics had about the same results as the imprisonments, it sort of may have had their thinking was that maybe this has a better, less serious repercussions for their international reputation, which was becoming increasingly important because it was important for Cuba to develop international and political alliances, and they couldn't do this if they have this record of imprisoning all their political prisoners. So people weren't really aware of what was going on with these other tactics because they, Amnesty International and the other organizations that were tracking political prisoners were able to report a decrease in political imprisonment, and yet they had just switched to different tactics. So in a 3-day period in March in 2003, March 18th to 1920, to 20 in 2003, this is referred to as the Black Spring. So during these 3 days, the Cuban government arrested and imprisoned, really political prisoners, 75 journalists, human rights activists, and pro-democracy demonstrators. So these arrests did spark condemnation across the globe from world leaders, and many of them then themselves started enacting sanctions against Cuba for human rights violations. So prior to the arrest, though, as I was saying, this waxing and waning, this cyclical thing of the repressions, the Castro regime had for several years been perceived as becoming perhaps somewhat lenient on dissent. And so scholars say that, well, perhaps this lured the critics of the government into a false sense of security. Well, we started this little pro-democracy group here, and we're still going, and nobody's locked us up, so maybe the time is right for us to get bigger. So some activists had come to believe that perhaps they had carved out a little bit of space for their work. But if we look at what happened right up to the Black Spring, this was largely in response to the Varela Project, which was an initiative for a referendum to change the Cuban Constitution. And this initiative was started by Oswaldo Paya in 1998. So it took this long, 4 years, for this to come to fruition. And so at this point in time, there was an article in the Cuban Constitution that stated that any legal initiative supported by at least 10,000 citizens' signatures would be discussed in the Cuban parliament. So believe it or not, Paya and his fellow activists gathered over 11,000 signatures on this petition, and you can imagine if the risk that people were taking by actually signing their name to a petition that was a pro-democracy project in Cuba. And it sought to initiate an electoral process that established civil rights, but also to begin a process of democratic reform, which is, really definitely counter-revolutionary. So the main proposals were centering on the rights to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, amnesty for political prisoners, the right to create business enterprises, and changing the electoral law, the way that the government is put in place. This project also received a considerable amount of international support. But when Paya submitted the petitions to the Cuban National Assembly on May 10th in 2010, after that, Castro himself, without going through the proper channels, amended the Constitution, reflecting the permanent and irrevocable status of Cuba as socialist. So basically saying, we're not doing that, it's against the law, it's against our institution. So of those 75 that were arrested in March, about half of those were people that were involved in gathering signatures for this pro-democracy project. And these prisoners were sent to prisons that were very far away from their homes. It was impossible for their families to visit because the transportation issues are difficult in Cuba alone. And the prison conditions were horrendous. The prisoners were tortured, they were denied food, they were denied water, they were denied medical care. And so 2 weeks after the crackdown, the wives, mothers, and daughters of these political prisoners formed a group which they called Las Damas de Blanco, the ladies in white. So this was a nonviolent protest group that were calling for an improvement in the prison conditions in which their loved ones were being held, but also to have them released. And so the women began gathering on Sundays in a Catholic church in Havana. They would have mass, and then they would walk 10 blocks to a nearby park. They all wear white. They carry these gladiolus flowers, and they have at this point in time they had a button, or they had a T-shirt that reflected their relative's name and associating that relative with the name of a prisoner of conscience. So within 2 years, the women began to be subjected to these harassment and also brutal attacks by these state-sponsored mobs. These are the rapid response brigades. And they were referring to these incidents as actos de repudio, or acts of repudiation. In other words, we are saying that what you're doing is absolutely has no place in our society. But they were designed to humiliate and intimidate dissidents publicly, but also violently. The mobs could involve hundreds of people, and they had bats and chains and pipes, and they shouted slogans and threats, and they also defaced and damaged the women's homes and their property. And so these were not revolutionaries or supporters of the regime that were just driven by this ideological frenzy to support the revolution. They were regular people, some of whom were neighbors, but they were often workers that were brought in by bus to by the government, because they owed the government, because government was providing their job, and so they were forced to enact this attack on their fellow citizens, because otherwise they would be subject to harassment or losing their jobs as well. But these were violent, very violent acts. So these women, the group, who had been in existence for about 15 years, they have resisted physical and verbal aggression on the streets, and because of this, they've gained support from international organizations and governments throughout the world. So they have won or been awarded these prizes for freedom of thought, the Sakharov Prize from the European Parliament. They've been awarded various human rights awards, an International Award for Human Rights, and the Milton Friedman Prize for Advancing Liberty. So their action is being very noticed by people throughout the world or other organizing groups. So in 2010, so their loved ones are still in jail. So in 2010, the group went to church leaders to ask them to intervene in the prisoners' release, because their conditions are really becoming dire, the people that are imprisoned. And so later that year, after 3 exceptionally violent acts of repudiation, this mob violence that lasted over 7 hours each against these women, Cardinal Jaime Ortega then sent a letter to Raul Castro asking for an end to the violence. So we see some intervention by church leaders. So the cardinal then began acting as an intermediary between the Castros and this group of protesters. And finally in 2011, those of the 75 prisoners who agreed to be exiled to Spain were released. So the condition of their release from these prisons was, you've got to go to Spain and never come back to Cuba again. So most of them said, sure, fine, okay. But 12 of the prisoners refused to leave Cuba, and they remained in prison. And so they said that they had given their word to Cuba and that they were going to achieve freedom and democracy from within Cuba and not from outside. So you've still got now 12 of these prisoners. And you can imagine their treatment after this, when they were granted the opportunity to leave and they chose not to because they still wanted to continue this fight for democracy. They were treated even worse in prison. And so after an 11-day hunger strike by one of the ladies, one of the damas. Finally, the remaining prisoners were released. And they were allowed to remain in Cuba, but all their movements and their activities are extremely limited, they're closely surveilled, and they cannot leave the country. So while other citizens can have a little bit more opportunity to leave the country, these 12 activists, these 12 former prisoners, cannot. So even after all of their relatives have been released, the damas continued to march weekly through the 9 of the 14 provinces of Cuba. But they've now expanded their focus to include the release of all political prisoners, adequate medical treatment of those prisoners who are still in prison, and they also want to promote national and especially international awareness of the human rights situation in Cuba. And they want to bring about social and political change. So now this is where I come to what I've done. The University of Miami has a Cuban heritage collection, and they have videos of oral histories that their researchers have undertaken with members of the women in this group, as well as some other human rights activists. But the videos are all in Spanish. So I was able to receive a summer research grant from the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, which enabled me to have 12 of these interviews translated and transcribed. And so I've spent the summer and much of the fall then analyzing these interviews and to answer a range of questions, but these are just sort of the top 5 that I was looking at for my first review. How did this social movement in Cuba emerge? What's the organizational structure? What are their strategies? How have the members themselves, not just the group, but the members themselves experienced government repression? And does the organization consider itself successful? So I was reading through and analyzing the transcripts of the oral histories that somebody else had taken to find answers to these questions. So the women in the group are of various ages, young women, older women, women in between. Many of these women have been active individually or in some of these other very small groups prior to this Black Spring. Many of these women themselves had previously been arrested for their activism before they joined the group, before the group arose, but also they have been fired from their jobs, or they have been beaten and harassed, or they've had their family members denied work or opportunities. So their children that were so excited about going to the university were denied their opportunities to go to university and study, or their in-laws were denied work opportunities because of their activism. But in all of their interviews, they're talking about this, experiencing this dawning of consciousness when they realized that what they experienced as a reality of life in Cuba was not what the picture that was painted by the Cuban government was. So many are saying things like, one woman said, I woke up and saw how and she was referring to Black Cubans, how we are being manipulated and used. They were being said, well, look how good you have it because of the revolution, you have the opportunity to work. There's no discrimination, and you should be lucky. You should not protest. And then one woman said, as a child, I was already questioning that something serious was going on. She's saying, I'm just got this feeling that something doesn't fit. Somebody's lying here. And this one, imagine this one. This woman she said, I was reading a book, and inside the book, I found the Declaration of Human Rights. So she said, when I saw that the world had established regulations as far as what human people could do, yet in my country, I and everyone else here, we couldn't do them. And that's when she said she realized that we were in a total trap. Another woman said she experienced the awakening of consciousness from books that were passed sort of like underground, just from books you could find in a library, but books that were passed from one to another that spoke about the way things could be in a democratic society. And she had said to her husband, we cannot bring up our children like this. Another woman described her family, meaning generational family, had fallen victim to manipulation and ignorance, and that she finally was able to remove the blindfold. And then another woman explained that she and her husband opened their eyes to the world once they had children. She said, we started to wake up and realize that there wasn't anything good about this system. She said there wasn't any kindness, there wasn't anything human, and so she said we took a stand because we felt that if we couldn't just sit back and watch all the things that the regime was doing, because if we didn't do anything, we would have felt that we were conspiring with them. So this image that we get about Cuba is often one that is presented by the state, the government, and we don't really have any knowledge of how the actual citizens of Cuba are living lives, or what their hopes and dreams for their country is like. So then after the March arrests, two women, Berta Soler and Laura Pollan, and then a handful of other women, they began attending the Santa Rita Catholic Church. They'd go to Mass and they'd pray. And then 2 weeks later, they had now become a group of 25. And so that's when they decided to dress in white, which symbolizes peace and purity, carry a gladiolus flower, which because of all those separate blooms, they say that symbolizes family. And they walked down Havana's Fifth Avenue in silent protest. And so each week, then more and more other relatives of the prisoners would join them. And then a month into this, Pollan organized what she called a literary tea time in her home, where the women got together and they read the letters of the prisoners who were the relatives, and they discussed the problems that the men were having in prison. So that's how they came to find out about what was going on in these prisons. And it was also a time of education about nonviolent protest. And as one of the women in the interviews put it, she said, Laura started to activate the women, which I like the way that term is used. So the organizational structure, of course, it was co-founded by Berta Soler and Laura Pollan. Pollan was the acknowledged leader, although in one of the damas in the interview said that there were many women that were capable of leading this organization, but they just agreed that it would be Laura Pollan. However, in 2011, Pollan died, and the descriptions of this are just unbelievable as you're reading about it. Pollan went to seek medical treatment. We hear of how wonderful the medical industry, not even that it's an industry, but how well people are cared for because of health needs in Cuba. However, she went to seek medical treatment for shortness of breath and a fever. She was hospitalized. She was not allowed any visitors. So then she was moved to another hospital very far away. She was intubated, she was drugged, and she was placed in intensive care, and she was still not allowed to receive any visitors. So she died 1 week later. And when the damas were finally able to track down her body and allowed to see it, they all said we couldn't recognize her. She was so swollen, she had been just so mutilated that we could barely tell that was who it was. So the damas and then others as well insist that Pollan died at the hands of the Cuban government. Of course, there's no proof. So at that point then, Berta Soler stepped up and became the new leader. The group now has about 300 members. And after Pollan's death, they established a set of rules because they were really concerned that the government would try to infiltrate them and get rid of them. So they don't solicit members. If any woman wants to join them, she must agree to abide by the rules, and then she's on probation for 3 months. And during that time, she can only participate in the walks. She can't do any of their other meetings or activities. So during this probationary period, then, new members are taught about nonviolent protest. And so now they have delegations throughout Cuba, throughout the whole island, and they also have developed a disciplinary council that decides what action needs to be undertaken. So the National Executive Committee is the one that heads these delegations in these other provinces. So now they've developed a very well-organized structure, and they've put in place strategies that would hopefully protect them from being disabled from within. So these are some of their strategies, which I've mentioned a little bit before. They walk very quietly. They don't engage. They don't carry signs. All they carry is their flower. They walk in a very dignified manner. And even when they're being harassed and intimidated and beaten, they don't respond to those acts, and they have never missed a Sunday. And these literary tea times, I would refer this to, we used to call consciousness-raising groups, but really they're training sessions. They're training sessions when they are being trained in peaceful protest, but they're also learning about the ways that other people have worked for democracy in their countries. They've also expanded their walks throughout all neighborhoods in Havana. So this was very strategic. They did this because they wanted other members of the country to understand what they were doing and what they were fighting for, and that there is a presence in the country that is mobilized for this. And they were also, this was a way that they generated solidarity among members of the whole country throughout the island and not just in Havana. They also wrote numerous letters to Fidel Castro and later to his brother Raul. They were constantly pointing out the injustices to the prisoners and their families, but they never received a response from them. And then they started to develop a relationship with the cardinal of the Catholic Church. That was Ortega. Before the church had, even though they leave from the church and they're associated with this church, the church had not ever reached out to try to work with them. This was the two leader women who developed this relationship with them. And so eventually then Ortega was able to act as an intermediary between the Damas and the Castros. And actually it was the Damas' idea to suggest to Castro that if he really wanted to get rid of these 75, he should release them and allow them to go to Cuba. But as both the two women wrote in their interviews, it was like, well, you know, the cardinal took credit for our idea. We've seen that happen before. And then something that generally the women did not do, but they engaged in hunger strikes. Hunger strikes are just a terrible, you know, they're terrible to the person who experiences it, but they really reflect badly on the government that you are demonstrating against. The idea that people, and especially women, would go to such lengths to bring a public awareness to that. And this is what garnered a lot of international condemnation and press and awareness of this must be really terrible if women are engaging in this. And then they've also organized delegations throughout the island, again, strengthening not just their organization, but developing solidarity from citizens across the island. And then recently, some of the Damas have had the opportunity to travel internationally to speak about their organization and their work. And so this is something that's increasingly important as well. There's reports of how they've experienced government repression are brutal. But at the very beginning, the government just wrote them off. Oh, they're just some ladies. They're a crazy bunch of old women. Nothing to see here, right? But then the government started really threatening, saying them, if you all keep up this walking, we're going to put you in prison for 20 years. And still, they kept it up, and then that's when the government realized that people throughout the island were becoming very familiar with the Damas, and they were standing in solidarity with them, and so that's when they really began to repress the women. And so in that first act of repudiation, these are examples, these acts of repudiation, when you've got the bombs, mobs. This was on Palm Sunday in 2005. There were 32 women that were walking at that time. They were met with more than 200 men and women in this mob, and they were trained by the Cuban government. They were carrying signs. They were carrying, of course, Cuban flags and bats and megaphones. And so the mob was publicly denouncing the women and calling them anti-revolutionaries and mercenaries of the imperialists. So they were sent by the U.S., right? And the women were beaten and threatened. And since this Palm Sunday in 2005, they have these acts of repudiation have become increasingly more violent. Women are reporting being beaten, being dragged, being kicked, having their hair pulled, and being violently forced into cars, which we would call kidnapping. And then they're dropped way off, far away, miles away into some field, and they have no way of letting anybody know where they are, and they can only walk back or take a very long way to get home. And so every Sunday, these violent mobs confront the Damas with the intent of, number one, getting individual women in this group to drop out of the movement. And some do leave, but others quickly join to take their place. And the Damas insist that they will not give up, they will not be dismantled. And they also conclude that this aggressive retaliation is, in addition to just for themselves, it's also to intimidate others from joining them. And so the Damas continue to insist that another way that they were experienced this government repression was that Laura Pollan was killed, murdered by the government in retaliation for their activism. And more recently, they're saying that local men have started causing problems. I wish I could ask them, but that's a problem with an oral history document that somebody else has taken. So they're saying that local men have started causing problems in the women's marriages. And they are explaining that, well, these are well-trained people using psychoanalytic tactics to get at the women's weaknesses in order to divide the group. So I'm really interested in specifically what they're doing, but I'm thinking it's sort of like a plan of maybe gossip and rumors that serve to drive a wedge in the women's family. And my last question here is, does the organization consider itself successful? Well, absolutely and unequivocally, yes, because number one, all the original 75 prisoners have been released, and yet they're continuing their activism. They're expanding their mission to advocate for the liberation of whatever political prisoners do remain in Cuba, and also to defend human rights. So this is where their focus is extending now. So in 2011, the group changed their name to the Laura Pollan Ladies of White. So they're acknowledging their original founder. And so when they're talking about their success, Soler in her interview said that the mission is being fulfilled because it's the international community that is beginning now to see what the reality of life is actually like in Cuba and for most of its citizens compared to these images that are portrayed by the government. So what they're really looking for now is increasing solidarity from the international community in the form of moral and spiritual support. And so the women are also trying to raise the consciousness of individual Cuban people. So they've got this two-pronged strategy now to work from within and get the Cuban people to themselves become activists or become to work for more democracy, but then to get more of the international community involved as well. And now if we're looking at this, waning and waxing, recently dissident activism in Cuba has become increasing because we've got communication campaigns, public demonstrations, and meetings in private homes, all this grassroots type of mobilizing. And these small bursts of activism have been met with concentrated efforts to diffuse it. They use arbitrary detentions. They can just pick you up and detain you for an unlimited of time. They'll come in and they'll search your home and destroy it. People are fired from their jobs. Their families are harassed. And people are evicted. They can evict people from their homes. And in the last 3 years, 9 members of the Damas have been arrested, and 2 of these women are still in prison. So in Cuba, the leaders of these small and some are somewhat large pro-democracy groups are very, very aware of the high stakes involved in the struggle for human rights. So their understanding is people are getting more activated. They're also being met with a more strict and severe repression. And yet they continue to struggle for this the struggle for democracy that really was begun in Cuba as long ago as the 1860s. So this is something that has been a war that's being waged from within for 160 years, and yet oftentimes we're not really aware of what individual Cubans, what their wishes and desires are, and how hard they're willing to work and sacrifice for that. So this is my end of my presentation. If anybody has questions or comments, that would be great. We have some time for that. Thank you.